Did the Nazis build UFOs? I know, it sounds like pure science fiction. But deep within the final, desperate days of World War II, something truly inexplicable was actually happening right up there in our skies. Picture this. Allied pilots are returning from bombing missions over Germany, and they're reporting things that just defy logic. I'm talking about, quote, balls of extremely fast-moving light resembling Christmas tree lights that toyed with aircraft. They called them Foo Fighters. And guys, these weren't hallucinations or combat fatigue. These were very real, seemingly impossible things literally dancing around our fighter planes. And honestly, they absolutely terrified the Allied forces. So, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack this incredible mystery. We're investigating the highly secretive, incredibly desperate wartime push by the Third Reich to develop these so-called wonder weapons. We're going to peel back the layers of myth here and look strictly at the historical documents, the blueprints, and the first-hand accounts that were recovered after the war. Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1, the flying saucer mystery. Now, you have to remember, aviation was still kind of in its absolute infancy at the end of World War II. But German engineers, they were pushing boundaries way beyond what anyone thought was possible. When most of us hear UFO, we immediately think of extraterrestrial myths, right? Aliens, science fiction, interstellar spaceship, the whole shebang. But the historical reality is far more grounded, and actually it's equally fascinating. Facing total obliteration by Allied bombing, the Nazis weren't trying to build spaceships. Out of sheer desperation, they were searching for radical military wonder weapons, specifically aircraft capable of vertical takeoff, just to counter their rapidly disappearing runways. And that brings us right back to those bizarre sightings starting in November 1944. These Foo Fighters were incredibly widespread. We're talking unexplained balls of light buzzing Allied aircraft, showing unmatched maneuvers and blistering speed. They couldn't be shot down, they couldn't be outmaneuvered, and they behaved entirely as if they were under intelligent control. Actually, the sightings were so frequent and so credible that Allied military command took them deadly seriously. They genuinely suspected these were highly advanced, top-secret German weapons currently in the testing phase. So that takes us to Section 2, the giant underground city. Now, you might be wondering, where exactly do you test and build radical aircraft when your entire country's industrial heartland is literally being bombed to rubble? Well, you go underground. Project Rise, which translates to the Giant, was essentially a Nazi Area 51. Now, what's really interesting about this concept is that it was a massive, interconnected underground facility bored directly into the solid rock of Poland's Alp Mountains. Totally safe from the RAF bombers above, this impenetrable labyrinth was designed to be the ultimate secret laboratory and production hub. But we really have to pause here and recognize the horrific human cost of all this secrecy. 40,000. That is the staggering, incredibly sobering number of slave laborers from nearby concentration camps who died digging these vast tunnels, chambers, and test rigs right out of the mountain. It was an environment of just pure misery. The SS ran this facility with absolute ruthless paranoia. Historical records actually refer to the prisoners who built it with this really chilling phrase, bearers of the secrets. They had no right physically to leave this place. To maintain total secrecy over these aviation experiments, the SS didn't hesitate for a second to ensure that anyone who went in never came out. Thousands were killed simply to keep this massive project hidden from the world. Moving on to Section 3, Project Bell and anti-gravity. So what exactly were they protecting with such murderous desperation? Well, deep inside these subterranean chambers, engineers were working on a top-secret device codenamed Die Glocke, or the Bell. Post-war blueprints break it down for us. It had this heavy, bell-shaped outer shell containing two large cylinders. These cylinders spun at incredibly high speeds in opposite directions, and get this violent kinetic process emitted a deadly radioactive energy force. In fact, many of the top scientists who worked on the Bell during its experimental phase actually died of radiation poisoning. The Bell was likely an experimental propulsion device for something else. Perhaps something an Austrian scientist named Victor Schauberger was developing, known as the repulsion craft. Schauberger created this basic tabletop design aimed at achieving completely vertical liftoff. And why was this such a big deal? Because vertical takeoff was literally the holy grail of aviation at the time. The Allies were completely obliterating German runways, right? So an aircraft that didn't need a runway to launch its payload was exactly what Hitler demanded, and he threw basically unlimited resources behind it. So the crucial point is captured perfectly by military historian Igor Witkowski. Based on historical documents recovered from the facilities, the Nazis weren't just trying to build, slightly better jets.
They were working on, quote, an exotic propulsion system linking gravity with quantum physics. They were genuinely trying to achieve anti-gravity to power these strange disc-like shapes. No way around it. That's what the paperwork says.
This brings us to Section 4, the post-war tech race. Let's see how this builds, because when the Nazi regime collapsed in 1945, this technology and the brilliant, if deeply morally compromised minds behind it, they didn't just disappear. It sparked a frenzied scramble by the victorious superpowers. The timeline here is just staggering. We start with those inexplicable Foo Fighters sightings in 1944. Immediately upon the war ending in 1945, we see Operation Paperclip, a massive, high-stakes intelligence scramble. And then, surprisingly, just 8 years later, in 1953, a fully public flying saucer project called the Avrocar is suddenly announced to the press. That 1945 scramble was unbelievably intense. On one side, we have the United States initiating Operation Paperclip. This was a top-secret mission to extract Germany's scientific elite, including Wernher von Braun, the guy who built the rockets that bombed London, who would later go on to build NASA's Saturn V rocket. On the other side, the Soviet Union captured over 2 million German patents. They took this massive technological booty to jumpstart their own industry, fueling their own disc-shaped aircraft, Project Tarielka. Both sides knew exactly what the Germans had been building underground, and they wanted it for themselves. And that brings us to the very terrestrial reality of the post-war flying saucer craze. The Avrocar was a very real, disc-shaped aircraft funded by the United States and built by a Canadian aviation company. But it wasn't alien. It was man-made, directly inspired by those earlier German concepts, and frankly, it didn't work very well at all. It hovered barely 2 meters off the ground, had terrible performance, and the project was ultimately canceled. I think this wonderfully demystifies the idea that all UFOs are extraterrestrial. Because sometimes they're just highly classified, deeply flawed military prototypes attempting to recreate wartime secrets. Which leaves us with a pretty chilling realization. The Nazis poured vast resources and thousands of innocent lives into a subterranean complex just to build weapons of terrifying potential. It really begs the question, if these hypersonic vertical takeoff crafts had been completed in time, if the Bell had successfully flown and delivered its deadly payloads to London or Moscow or New York, how would history have changed? We were right on the brink of that delivery being made. It's a dark what-if that proves history is often stranger and for sure far more frightening than science fiction. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the world around you, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.